Thank you to everybody for coming to this really well attended, really interesting labour market conference today, and thank you for coming along to this really interesting session about older workers and younger workers. We've heard a lot in the past few years about the needs problem, the problem of young people being unemployed, not in education, employment or training. We've heard less about the problems that go with older workers being out of work, and also the fact older workers take up an increasing part of the overall workforce. We've got a really good panel this morning to discuss these issues and more. Starting to my left, this is John Philpott, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. This is Christopher Brooks, who is the Policy Advisor to AgeUK. To my right is Tom Wilson, who's the Director of Union Learn, and Matt Tinsley, who's from Policy Exchange, who's writing a report about older workers, which he'll tell you more about, which we'll be publishing over the next month or so. John has kindly agreed to go first. What we'll do is each speaker will speak for between 5 and 10 minutes, then we'll open the floor to questions for around half an hour or so. So John?
Would you like us to stand?
It's easier to hear.
Yeah, okay. Good morning. Just a bit of context, the CIPD that I work for is the professional body for human resource professionals in the UK and Ireland. We've got about 135,000 members. I thought what might be useful as a start is just to give some context to the situation facing both ends of the age spectrum in the labour market. Essentially the 16 to 24s and the 50 pluses and the 65 pluses, if you sort of want to lump them all together. I think if you were looking at what I guess really should be the sort of meat of any employment policy discussion, and that's the sort of structural components of these problems. If you look at the 16 to 25 group, there's probably been a sort of slight structural deterioration in the youth labour market, beginning in the middle of the last decade, 2004, 2005. So there was a sort of creeping, not dramatic, but a sort of creeping rise in youth employment. If you take the older group, the 50 pluses, I think their labour market position seemed to deteriorate quite a lot from the late 70s through to about the mid-90s, but has actually been sort of gradually improving since then. So, you know, the things underlying the labour market for that group have been improving somewhat. Now, both the age groups have also been affected by the cyclical impact of the recession, but that's been relatively hard hitting on the younger cohort. We've seen youth unemployment rise to probably double its structural rate. So the sort of headline number is about 20% plus, whereas the structural rate is probably about 10%. Whereas actually for the older age group, we've seen a relatively small rise in unemployment, and employment rates for that group have actually held up quite well, and indeed for the over 65s have gone up during the recession, which is quite good and encouraging for the future, I think. What about policy? I think two things. One is addressing the recessionary impact. That obviously is largely a matter of macro policy, but if you're thinking in terms of employment policy, the appropriate response, I think, is probably not age-related at all, but is better directed at duration of unemployment, regardless of age. And so, you know, one might have something like a kind of job guarantee for people who have been out of work for 9 months, 12 months, or whatever, but that applicable to everybody, that would seem to make most sense. I mean, I know politically, young people are the flavour of the month, but I'm not entirely sure in terms of responding to the recessionary impact on youth unemployment, that is in itself fair. What about the structural problems? I think with regard to youth unemployment, it's essentially two related things. One is just poor basic education, which has inflicted sort of too many of our young people. And associated with that is a sort of lack of employability skills, sort of communication, ability to teamwork, just kind of basic work habits, which surprisingly seem lacking in quite a lot of younger people. As regards to older workers, I think the sort of key issue is more about improving updating the skills that they have. I think for many older people, the skills, they may well be experienced, but their skills will be of an older vintage. In addition, and again, you know, one has to be careful talking about older workers if you're talking about people from 50 onwards, because those in their early 50s have sort of different needs and aspirations to those in their mid to late 60s. But there is quite a strong desire for more flexible working opportunities, and that can be a barrier to retaining or encouraging them back into work. I think there might be sort of issues around the sort of health of that older group as well. There's quite a lot of debate about how people's health deteriorates as they get old, and to some extent we have a fitter older population today than we would have done in the past. But nature being what it is, the older you get, the more prone you are to potential sort of recurrent ill health problems, which may need to be addressed in terms of helping people into work. What can government do about this? I think with regard to young people, it's fairly clear. It's improvements in basic education and training, but also things like sort of work experience, engaging employers within the schooling system so that more young people are job ready and not prone to the kinds of sort of barriers to employment that many of them experience. With regard to older workers, I think encouragement of flexible working practices, workplace health issues are quite important, and also encouragement to employers to do more to train people as they get older. It's still very much the case that a lot of training investment is given to relatively young people, either younger entrants to the labour market who are skilled and trainable, or people in their sort of 20s and up to 40s. They get the bulk of the training investment. Older people get relatively less of that, so we need much more ongoing learning and development in that respect. How much of this should be, in a sense, mandated, sort of requiring employers to do it? How much of it should be more about encouragement and nudging employers? I think there's a serious debate to be had about this. I think as a default position, encouragement and selling the business case to employers is quite important, but especially if you're talking about older workers, you know, steps have had to be taken with regard to things like age discrimination in recruitment, which was outlawed some time ago, and last year we saw the removal of the full retirement age. And it's not, you know, sort of insignificant that all of these things cause a great deal of controversy in the employer community. So it suggests that just relying on voluntarism may not be the appropriate way forward, and you may need to give that kind of legislative push from time to time. Finally, the sort of last question on the list here is how could the interests of younger and older workers come into conflict with each other? I don't inherently think that there is an intergenerational conflict. I think there are short-term difficulties because of a depressed labour market, which means that sort of helping young people or older people can be to the short-run detriment of the other age group. But looking over the sort of longer time span, we actually have an ageing population population. We need to get more people into work for longer. There isn't any problem of doing that as far as the younger population is concerned, because by making greater use of our older human capital, we'll actually have a much more dynamic labour market and economy, and that would be able to generate jobs for everybody. And indeed, we need to maybe have more older people in work, but we also need a far more productive and engaged sort of younger workforce to boost the productivity and incomes that our economy overall needs. That's my kind of general overview. I think colleagues will fill in sort of more of the sort of policy detail and evidence, but so I'll be happy to take questions or engage in discussion at the end.
Thanks very much. Firstly, I think it's worth saying that it's an excellent idea to have a seminar that's looking at both older and younger workers at the same time. And all too often in labour market commentary, it's pitched as a battle of one versus the other, which at best is unhelpful and at worst is misrepresentative of what actually goes on. In fact, younger and older job seekers share many common barriers to work, to getting back into work. They both tend to be negatively stereotyped by prospective employers. They're both more likely than other people of other ages to be discriminated against because of their age, and they both, for very different reasons, often have difficulty selling their skills and experience to employers. And as John mentioned, the 50-plus employment rate has held up well during the recession, whereas of course the youth employment rate hasn't. But the problem really lies for people who lose their jobs and find themselves out of work. Obviously, AgeUK's focus is on older workers, by which we normally mean 50 plus. We use that generally because it's roughly the age at which we start seeing more incidents of age discrimination occurring, and particularly from the mid to late 50s, that's when it really tends to increase. And for this group, in spite of the high unemployment rate, when people find themselves out of work, it can be very difficult to get back in. As the blurb for this event, I think, said that it's harder for people to get back in. I think it's 60% more likely to be unemployed for a year if you lose your job. The average length of spell of unemployment is longer for older workers. And we also recently did a little bit of analysis of what happens to people when they move out of unemployment. So when they find a job or become inactive. For 50 plus people, it's actually about a 50-50 split between the two. So while half of unemployed 50 plus are moving back into work, which is great, the other half effectively make themselves retired because they can't find work and they just get too frustrated with the process of being rejected and they give up, which is obviously a real waste of human capital. And it's also a shame that the government then tends to not tackle the issues facing these people so much because they cease being a cost to them. It's clearly important to look at why people face barriers. The government in general, apart from its policy towards under 25s, it's moved away from an age-focused welfare to work approach. But there are still age-related issues with some of the services. So Job Centre Plus, often the advisors don't understand the needs of their older clients. And many people report having bad experiences with Job Centre Plus. We see that quite often there have been some initiatives trying to help advisors. There are things like the 50 Plus Works website, and there was some training as well for advisors which AgeUK was involved in. So these are very proactive and very positive, but the jury's still out to a degree on how effective they have been. And with all the churn on Job Centre Plus staff as well, it's quite hard to evaluate the long-term impact that this is going to have. It's also, I think, worth looking at the work programme briefly. Obviously, as we said earlier, we still have no idea about how it's performing for anybody. I'm slightly sceptical that it's going to really help many of the 50 plus people. For a typical job seekers allowance claimant, you have to wait 12 months to be referred onto the work programme, which for many people is just simply too long. They're either not going to be eligible for means tested benefits and so won't be claiming job seekers allowance for long enough, probably because their partner works, or they're just going to give up because they get too frustrated. So it's doubtful how many people it's going to help. But again, if people drop out of the system and they cease becoming a cost to the Treasury, then the government tends to lose interest in this. We also have to be realistic and acknowledge that some of the barriers are at the root of the individuals themselves. Often, older job seekers may have worked continuously for 20, 30 years. They probably haven't applied for a job for a long time. So they may find that they're not totally familiar with the modern job search processes. So things like filling in application forms may be totally new to them and may be a challenge. They may not be particularly good at writing a CV that grabs an employer's attention. So some of the barriers do fall on the individual. Obviously, these hinder people getting back into work. And that's something that we tackle in our work as well, where we try and help people, often with the softer side of filling in CVs and doing that type of things. There's also the issue of skills. Older workers are twice as likely to have no qualifications as everybody else, and when they do have qualifications, then quite often they're sort of 40 years old, and obviously the technical components of qualifications decline over time. So, but if you have a qualification that's 40 years old, it demonstrates that you can do something at that particular time, but subsequently it probably it's at least reduced in value, or could even be valueless. At the other extreme, we often find that people contact us and they've been told that they're overqualified or too experienced to do a job, which essentially is age discrimination. It emphasises a lot of the importance of the role of line managers in the recruitment process. And it's the polar opposite of that which is experienced by young people who find that, again, skills are a barrier, but for totally different reasons, because they can't necessarily demonstrate that they have work experience to move into employment. Some of the responsibility also has to fall on employers. There's firstly the big overarching issue of demographic change. There's still a gap in attitudes among employers and the reality of what's going on. It's obviously totally understandable that in a recession many businesses are struggling and they're thinking about the short-term survival. But we have an ageing workforce, and so being focused on the short term exclusively doesn't make how they as a business are going to deal with this in the future. It doesn't make that go away, so they still need to be thinking about it. There was some interesting research by the CIPD that was published about 18 months ago, where they found that only 14% of managers thought that their organisation was actually prepared for the ageing workforce, which demonstrates a really shocking under-preparedness and just how many employers are going to struggle in sort of 5 or 10 years as the workforce starts to age, and they find that they're having to increasingly rely on the workers to fill their skills needs. Of course, if they don't adjust their organisational policies and practices, they're much more likely to fail to address some of the issues around stereotyping. They're more likely to end up discriminating, excluding older workers, and for that matter, younger workers, from selection for job roles and then for training and progression within the organisation, which is bad for individuals and it's bad for business as well. So it makes absolute sense that employers put more effort into tackling this problem. I also wanted to mention, as a final point really, about flexible working, and obviously John's already talked about this. There's definitely a greater acceptance of flexibility needed. It's quite erratic at the moment, and it hinges quite heavily on each individual line manager and what their view of flexibility is. And so that you can get huge disparities even within an organisation, where one line manager somewhere will be very in favour of flexible working, very happy to help their employees work from home or do work flexi time or do whatever it is that's necessary for them. And then another line manager may have the complete opposite view, and so they're much more reluctant to help the individual. And we had some research done recently by the University of Kent, and we're just about to publish a report based on this research, which shows that this is a particular problem for people. Flexible working, when done well, can be hugely beneficial for individuals, as it can help balance their personal commitments with their work around some of the issues that John mentioned, around declining health, so managing health conditions, in particular caring responsibilities and how employers allow people to care for their elderly relatives in particular, but also maybe grandparents doing more childcare. Those type of things are all covered by flexible working. And so how employers deal with this is very, very important. There's no particular example of any size of employer or type of employer who's good at flexibility. It just varies, and it's disparity among line managers. It can be quite striking, quite concerning. So, just as a concluding point, to make a cross-generational point, the good employers here are really crucial in improving employment practice. It is very important to the future of younger and older workers, and indeed other marginalised groups within the labour market as well. The good employers will often tend to be ones who don't look at one issue in isolation, so they won't just think about how they help older workers, but they'll look at all issues. They'll look at diversity and inclusion across the board, and they'll tend to accept the business case for it and integrate it into their business plans. And then identify the groups who are likely to be adversely affected by this, and see how they can actually help them using their diversity and inclusion framework. So there's a real possibility for improving practice and reaching out, which I think will help a large number of people across the labour market, and is ultimately a win-win for everybody, for businesses and individuals. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Matthew?
Thanks, Dave. I agree with a lot of points put across so far. For young workers, it clearly is this need of not being in education, employment or training. And it's not only is it very high right now, around 20%, but it's never actually really dropped below 10%, which John refers to as the structural level. Most of the time it bounced around about 14% of young people coming out and not being in any form of activity. And this isn't something that's really addressed at all over the last 15 years. We've continued to assume that unemployment wasn't a problem. It almost just went out of fashion as a kind of area of research. But we did not address this underlying problem of inactivity, which is primarily affecting younger workers. And so a lot of it right now appears to be because it is really a buyer's market in the labour market. There's a real trouble getting into work because there's no proof of skills or experience. But we have to also look to address that underlying factor, which is that a huge amount of people coming out of our education system do not have clear pathways into work. There is not for a lot of people coming out, and I think for a lot of policymakers, the mindset of what's coming out is that people do the GCSEs and the A-levels and their degree, then go to a grad scheme. That's only legitimate for about 30% of the population. And so quite clearly we need to think about those pathways all the way through, making sure that we have the structures in place to allow people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of intentions in life to get into the workforce, to gain that experience. In terms of addressing the problems that we have now, in terms of the massive numbers, about 1 million people young people out of work, a lot's been said about kind of job guarantees, about kind of subsidised apprenticeship schemes. My concern here is that we get to a stage where we are putting people into any sort of work, and that actually what we want to do is to make sure people can gain the skills and experiences they require to actually go up and kind of carry on and go forward and not have these big scars that are left on them for the rest of their lives. So I see the only real way we're actually going to hack away at this big 1 million young people out of work is genuine economic growth. I'm not sure there's any other avenue that we're actually going to make a significant difference to the lives of young people, whilst there are clearly short-run things we can do to try and kind of put a plaster on it. Right now what we need is long-run growth. And obviously that's a discussion for a different area. In terms of older workers, we don't really have a comparable statistic. We can't look at neathood in older workers because so often being out of work is an option that they choose themselves. The idea of looking at inactivity among older workers seems rather bizarre when whether you want to retire at 50 or 70 is quite clearly a choice of the individual in their circumstances. And so it's very hard to find a big headline statistic which makes the troubles of the older workforce look real. And so there seems to be a bit of a contradiction in the older workforce. Since the beginning of 2007, the amount of people employed over the age of 50 has increased by about 640,000. At the same time, the rest of the workforce, the under 50, has decreased by nearly that much. And so on the face of it, it appears older workers are doing rather well. Clearly a lot of this is demographic shift. Everyone knows we have an aging population. But there are other factors that have gone on as well. If we look at skills, the probability of a 50 to 65-year-old having a degree now is 3 times what it was 15 years ago. And so there's clearly this generation that grew up in the post-war years had a far better access to education than any of that come before. They're working in more skilled roles and they're less susceptible to some of kind of seasonal changes and recession-based effects that have seen the older workforce scrapped in the past. At the same time, there are massive downsides. Some of the research that we're releasing in the next month or so, one of the statistics that caught my eye the most was looking at the probability of an older worker who is unemployed today finding work at any point within the next 12 months. The probability is less than 40% of finding any form of work. A huge amount, as Chris mentioned, just simply slide out into an activity, whether it's they've retired because they've given up, or because they find some other avenue onto health benefits or whatever. Now, for younger workers, that's up to about 60% finding some sort of work. So older workers are clearly finding it much more difficult than younger workers to get in. Now, part of that has to be the support that we offer. Job Centre Plus, as has been mentioned, can be very rigid in its structure. The personalisation often hasn't been there. We're hearing some relatively good things about introducing flexibility, about the support that advisors can offer, but I think it has to go a lot further. Taking Job Centre Plus back to a framework where it needs the individual to come over some gross generalisation because of their age or how long they've been on benefits or what benefits they are on. And we've been pushing for that for quite a while through our entire welfare reform series over the last 12 months. Another problem that I think is rather cultural. Older workers are seen as on their way to retirement. But if you have someone who's 55 years old, quite clearly they could be, if they're only going up to state pension age, a huge amount of people wanting to work past the state pension age. They are looking for a long period of time which they are looking to be active in the workforce. And so simply discarding them or businesses seeing them as no longer a viable option for their employment is completely the wrong way of looking at it. I think for a start we need to be talking about the older workforce more. We're looking at how it's more skilled and how we can utilise those skills and the phenomenal experience which is more valuable now than ever. A report from the CIPD out a couple of months ago mentioned that the value of skills and experience has never really been higher. And so we need to recognise that and see employers actually bringing older workers through and giving them another chance into the workforce, because as soon as they get in, there's no risk of lack of productivity because of their old age. There's another avenue as well that I'm quite positive about, which is health problems. Health problems have dropped dramatically for the older workforce, up to about 40% in 10 years, the probability of leaving work because of health issues. Now clearly that's pointing towards a workforce who are not at risk of just sliding out and falling into health benefits after a couple of years at work and therefore a bad investment for an employer. There's real potential to bring them through. And so we have this slightly bizarre problem where it's very hard to get back into work, and yet there are a huge amount of them kind of finding their way to work or staying into work. And so I think it's this kind of in-out system for older workers. Huge amounts of older workers in work, very valued by their employer. A lot of older workers out of work are simply seen as kind of superfluous. There are other options employing people who are generally younger. And so to kind of wrap it up, I'm relatively I'm relatively optimistic about the opportunities for the older and the younger workforce. The older workforce is more skilled, more experienced than ever before, more able to work in less manual jobs and carry on and work later in life. But at the same time, I'm relatively positive about the younger workforce. Despite all the general shock stories that are given around, I think we have a group of people approaching the workforce nowadays who are phenomenally in touch with modern technologies and the world around them, and if brought into the workforce properly, can play a huge role in innovation and kind of wealth creation in the future. The problem is that we are failing to utilise that. We are failing to put the tracks into work for both older and younger workers. So that will be the area I'll be talking about, as well as culturally recognising where our strengths are for both older and younger workers.
Thanks very much, Matt. As Matt mentioned, we do have some research on older workers written by Matt coming out over the next month, so that's worth keeping an eye out for. Brandon, Tom?
As an older worker, I hope you don't mind if I stay sitting down. But if you can't hear me, then say so and I'll stand up. Try and stand up. First of all, just a bit about Union Learn, because some of you may know a bit about it, but probably quite a few perhaps don't. We're the learning and skills arm of the TUC. We employ about 130 staff, 6 offices up and down the country. We're funded by the government relatively generously, I want to put that on record, to the tune of around about £22 million a year. And for that, what we do is we support learners in the workplace, both union members and non-union members, to access learning, encourage employers to offer better training schemes, set up workplace learning centres, all that kind of stuff. We have 28,000 trained union learning reps who are, if you like, union reps who specialise in learning in the workplace. By far the biggest change agents in the entire UK economy, we like to think, around skills. 28,000 is a phenomenal number, and they're very active up and down the country. We have 1,500 workplace learning centres. We work with thousands of employers. Last year we trained, or we introduced into some form of learning, I should say, well over 250,000 learners who wouldn't otherwise have had that training through the union movement. So we do a lot. We're very proud of it. I've just got a number of kind of comments, because I broadly agree with most of the other speakers' views, but I think there's a few things that I think are worth adding. One is, what can we actually do about this? I mean, very good analysis, but okay, what do we do about it? Well, one of the things you can do about it is by engaging very actively with employers and encouraging and supporting and challenging employers to do more and to do it better. And that's what we do a lot of as a union movement. And very often we find we're kind of pushing it at the door, because employers on learning and skills, many people have said, know that they've got to improve. So the first thing that they need to do is to engage their workforce, because you can't make people learn, they have to want to learn. And that's where unions can actually play a big role. So we sit down with employers, we say to them very often, look, you're spending not enough on training, you need to spend more, you need to spend it better, you need to do a better analysis of what your workforce needs, and that often means all the workforce. Time and time again, what we find is the employer spends quite a lot, relatively, on those who've already got lots of skills. The senior managers, the people who are already relatively well qualified, graduates and so on. Very often we find they spend nothing on the bottom 40%. If you take the NHS as an example, the bottom 40% of their, I'd say the bottom in terms of the pay distribution, the bottom 40% of employees who deliver 80% of patient contact receive 4% of the NHS training budget. Astonishing figures. And you think, where's the rest of that training budget going? It's going on very well paid, very, very senior, very well qualified consultants, doctors, managers and so on, who, I'm sure they need the training. But is that a sensible way of allocating the training expenditure? And that pattern is repeated in many, many companies. Now, we're working very closely with the NHS to try and help them to turn that around, to improve it. So we have learning agreements that we sign with many, many major employers, including Microsoft, actually, interestingly. And the purpose of those learning agreements is to try and persuade the employers to do more, both for younger workers and for older workers. So, and as John was saying earlier on, it's not a battle between these two kind of demographic cohorts. They very much work together. You know, we need to grow the economy. We're not going to do that unless older workers are kind of raising their participation level, and that in turn creates jobs for younger workers. But there's a much more direct way in which older and younger workers work together, and that's through, in effect, kind of family learning. And you know, Campaign for Learning, which Trish Hartley here runs, is absolutely exemplary. Family learning is the way in which to, perhaps the main way in which young people who are disaffected and turned off, that core within the kind of needs problem, who really need to get some sort of motivation and energy behind it. How do you do that? You do it by motivating their parents and the people that they respect and work with as well. And our members, very often the ULR will be somebody who is, if you like, a kind of an auntie or an uncle figure in the workplace, who will put an arm around the shoulder of the young lad or lass who's coming into work and help them to keep jobs, to maintain jobs, to turn up to work, to do the kind of things you need to get a foot in the workplace. And for young people who are neat, who some decent employer has given them a chance, that's what they need in order to hold down and keep a job. So all too often it's about churn. People come in, a few weeks later they've gone out again. So to combat that, you need to find ways of really hanging on to people and making sure that they can work well. And that works just as much at the other end of the market too. What we find is that, take the public sector. In the last 12 months, something like 150,000 public sector jobs have gone. Most of them have been in the over 50s. What are they all now doing? Around about half of them have just dropped out entirely, as various speakers have said. Why have they done that? Partly because they think, well, it's just not worth the hassle trying to kind of engage with the system, to get back into work, and it's just so difficult and so weighted against them. I served for a while on an inquiry into the future of lifelong learning, which was something that NIAS put together a couple of years back. And one of the really interesting things that inquiry did was to look at the total pattern of expenditure on all kind of skills education, whether it's private or public. How much goes to young people, how much goes to those in their 20s and 30s, how much to people in their 40s, and 50s, and 60s, to people in their 70s and 80s. And it's an absolute stark curve, exactly as you'd expect. But for the over 50s, they were receiving 2% of the entire national skills budget. For the over 17s, it was less than 0.25%. For the under 25s, it was, as you'd expect, around about 80%. Now, broadly speaking, yeah, of course we need to invest in young people more than old people, but does that kind of pattern of expenditure make sense? I think not. And it wouldn't have taken a great deal in terms of shifting some of those to effectively double the expenditure that's then given to the over 50 cohort, because you're starting from such a low base. So there's lots of things you can do on that front. Just a couple of other points. There's still an awful lot of stigma and frankly poor practice around young people's employment. Take apprenticeships. I mean, what John Hayes, the Minister, said this morning was absolutely right. It's a flagship programme, we're very supportive of it, it's a good programme. But the recent Low Pay Commission report, if you look at it, it included a survey carried out by Hayes on how many employers are actually paying the appropriate apprenticeship rate, low pay rate. 30% of them were not. That's to say 30% of apprentices were not even receiving the £2.60 per hour, which is hardly generous, rate, which is the Low Pay Commission stipulated rate for young people under the age of 19 or in the first year of their apprenticeship. So you've got vast levels of kind of underpayment, and that probably wasn't deliberate. That's not implies kind of deliberately flagging the law, it's just ignorance probably, lack of systems to make sure it happens properly. Although there is some evidence that some employers are repeated offenders, deliberately don't pay, effectively use apprentices as cheap labour. Why is that important? Because it effectively tarnishes the entire brand. And anybody who then thinks of taking on an apprenticeship or enrolling on an apprenticeship is beginning to think, well, is this really a proper, decent training programme, or is it a bit of a kind of a repeat of the old YTS and YOC programmes of years ago? I don't think it is. I think the current apprenticeship programme is pretty good, but it is certainly, I think, in danger of being tarnished by that sort of thing. Similarly, at the other end of the labour market, you've got many, many older workers who will know from their own experience, people who aren't necessarily terribly well skilled and qualified, who've been made redundant, perhaps in their early 50s, they will have experience of those kinds of schemes back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And that's partly, I think, why they are a little bit disengaged and turned off and find it difficult to kind of engage with the range of schemes that are currently available. So the quality of employment support, both for young workers and for older workers, I do think needs attention. And it's partly about communicating it more effectively, but it's also about the quality of what's there. And the media is not helping this, because what the media focus on, of course, is graduate unemployment. They have picked up, finally, on the scandal of so-called internships and work placements, which are effectively completely unpaid, illegally very often, because they should be at least paid a such minimum wage. But frankly, graduate unemployment is, what is it, 10%? It's not great, but it's nothing like the 50% rate of unemployment amongst black BME communities without any kind of skills at all, who, if you look at the demographic coincidence of pockets of those people and where the riots took place in London, it's not a surprise that there's quite a strong overlap there. So, the real pockets of massive, acute unemployment and issues, I think, which are those which should be top priority, are not really about kind of youth unemployment as a whole. It's a very complex area, but about particular pockets of needs, very often around BME communities, very often in particular parts of the country. And about particular kinds of older workers who all too often are simply dropping out. The final point is this. I was reading a very interesting article in the FT this morning about the US labour market. And what it was pointing out was the fact that overall participation in the US labour market has dropped by about 3%. It's much lower than ours, but it's also falling. Ours is levelling off, beginning to dip a bit. Theirs has really dropped quite substantially. 3% of the entire US labour force is now no longer active. If you were to add those to the current US unemployment rate, that would mean their unemployment rate was near 11%, not 8%. An 11% unemployment rate in the US, which you could argue is perhaps the real unemployment rate, would be a far, far bigger, much more acute and visible problem than what looks to be a relatively stable 8% rate. If you apply that same analysis to the UK, okay, the figures might not be quite so stark, but my guess would be that actually there is a big, big problem of under-participation, particularly amongst older workers, which is not showing through in the figures, precisely because people drop out. So they don't really come through as strong as they could. And that is what we are experiencing. Our members, the 7 billion union members that we represent, many of those are older workers, and many of those are coming to the end of their career, not because they want to, because they're losing their jobs in their early to mid-50s. And what do they find? The end of this sort of progression, not all of them, but around about half, I'd agree with that figure, are just, if you like, disappearing from the stats. And that is a really massive problem, not just for them, but for the UK economy.
Thank you very much for really fascinating contributions there. We have some time for questions, if anybody wants to.
David Smith from the Conservative Policy Forum. There seems to be a slight disconnect between two pieces of generally accepted knowledge, one of which is that a lot of young people lack certain basic skills to help them operate in the workforce, be that timekeeping or working teams or public speaking. And something that was implied in what Matt said, but also mentioned by someone in the earlier session, which was that we need to be putting people into good quality, highly skilled jobs and allowing them to demonstrate their skills in order to do that. It seems to me there's a bit of a disconnect between those two things, because a lot of the ways in which you demonstrate that you have skills are by going through lower paid, less skilled jobs, proving that you're reliable, that you can turn up to work on time. And that's why people who do Saturday jobs or work whilst they're at university tend to do well in the job market immediately after university, because they've proved that reliability. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's take on that dichotomy, perhaps, between making sure people have decent jobs that suit their skill level and their intelligence, but also allowing them to demonstrate through perhaps some less pressured jobs that they have those skills.
Should we start with John and move on?
Yeah, I mean, on the, I mean, there isn't actually, you know, going back to sort of very sort of basics on this, there isn't actually much of a problem of skill shortage in the UK economy. I mean, I think, you know, the real problem for young people is this sort of lack of experiential skills, soft skills and what have you. And the point is that it's actually lacking in low-skilled work as well as more highly skilled work. And I think it's probably got, you know, something to do with the way that you know, children are brought up nowadays, but also probably due to the fact that schooling doesn't equip people in that kind of way in an appropriate sense on a sort of day-to-day basis. I mean, as you say, they have to do it through Saturday jobs, you know, those kinds of things. And I think the only way around it that I can see is experience for young people in that sort of, you know, the 13 to 16 age group, you know, the opportunity to go into businesses, you know, see how employment works, do it like that. And of course, you need a lot of employer engagement to do this. Now, I mean, one of the things that's really odd is that that's, to my mind, that's been a recommendation for about 25 years. And you get lots of examples of employers saying, you know, we're keen on doing this, and, you know, I mean, there have actually been sort of support groups and others, employee support groups that try to do this, but for some reason they don't. I think what they're doing is they're probably engaging with essentially the kind of kids who are going to do reasonably well anyway, and the ones that they're not getting through to are those who are prone to become NEET. And I think the sort of key is how to bridge that gap between the potential needs and employers rather than sort of school children in general. That would be my, you know, sort of thing. I mean, it's a difficult one because, you know, I think one of the issues for the NEET population is that this isn't a purely kind of labour market and skills related phenomenon. I mean, you know, you're talking about kids from very disadvantaged and dysfunctional backgrounds where work may not be part of the kind of social zeitgeist, if you like. So persuading them of the importance of doing what 90% of the population think is the right thing is quite challenging.
I guess really that's a barrier that predominantly affects younger people, not so much older workers. But I mean, I guess broadening up the age range workers' households as well, and the importance of family members going to work as well. So actually getting people of all ages back into work and the influence that has on their children is very important.
When I was a student, I worked in a building site. Couldn't do that now because you need a construction safety certificate card. They worked in a hotel, couldn't do that now because I needed all sorts of digital skills, which I wasn't about at the time. I worked in a hospital as a porter in the X-ray department, couldn't do that now because you need far more out of the skills. So all the way through, all the kinds of jobs that students do now do require a much higher threshold of skill, often ICT skills, computer skills. Even jobs that you might think of as being relatively unskilled, like say, being a waiter or a waitress or working in retail and so on. If you think about retail, you have to operate the tills, you have to do buildings. There are many, many young people who can't pass that threshold. They're effectively being excluded, even from those relatively low-level jobs. So I think the fact that the entry level for almost any job in the UK economy has risen is the problem. That's what's excluding this massive cohort of young people who haven't even got those entry-level skills. And if you think about London, that's why when you go into any shop in London, the chances are you're going to be served by a student who will have those sorts of skills. And 10% of the entire UK economy, by the way, is students. 10% of the entire labour force are students. That's a big number of people, particularly in London. Or by migrant workers. And it's still the case even now. If you go into many hotels, restaurants, pubs, etc., there'll be migrant workers who are working there. And that's an issue because they are effectively, in some ways, displacing people who would have done those jobs otherwise. Big contentious area, but So I think the problem is partly about zeitgeist, as John has said, but I think it's also about what employers can do to try and help young people to cross that threshold. It's not impossible. Many of the agreements that we reach with employers do exactly that. And they'll work, with outreach. Tesco's, for example, a good example. Tesco's got a mixed record, but actually on this they're good. And they do work very often with local communities to try and help young people who haven't a clue how to put together a CV, haven't a clue how to operate a computer, maybe great on a mobile phone, but don't know much about computers, and help them to at least get to a position where they get an interview, they get the 6 weeks, maybe they stay a bit longer. That's where Usdaw, the union that works in Tesco's, can then put the arm around the shoulder and help those young people to effectively cross that threshold. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen, but it's difficult.
I'll go on a couple of points. John made the point about lack of soft skills and work experience. I think about when I came through school, with a relatively average state school, and nobody in that school would have had a very good idea of what the world of work looked like. And so actually kind of getting them to follow down a pathway that's going to see them into work is not really that practical, because how on earth would they know what that looks like? And so I think there is a real disconnect between education, that has been mentioned in the earlier session, a disconnect between education and work. It almost seems like you leave at a certain age, whether it's 16, 18 or 21, 22 after a degree, and then you just kind of find yourself into work and learn on the job. So I think we have to smooth that process a little bit. I think I also agree with Tom, it's sometimes a little bit intangible, but there's some sense in which the economy has been become more specialised and diversified, and therefore the entry-level skill has gone up. And it can be a little bit hard to put a figure on it. If I'm completely honest, I haven't seen much research on it at all, but it's certainly something we should be looking at and thinking, well, okay, we can say that a work experience is necessarily nice, but if it's genuinely not practical because there are no jobs in this economy which demand that, and therefore it's very hard to put together, how do we facilitate that? I think it probably needs a separate bit of research on it.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I don't know if any of the panels got access to any research or done much study on the proportion of older workers who then move into some form of self-employment or business startup.
I was going to ask that question.
Yeah.
Might try and take a handful of questions now as we're published. If anyone else wants to ask questions about this.
Federation of Small Businesses. We're at the moment working on a project with Westminster Business School on the way small businesses employ, and research so far has confirmed initial findings that small businesses tend to employ people who have not necessarily got degree level skills or academic skills and recorded skills, but have other skills, and also employ people who've been disadvantaged in the labour market and women. And we're in the process of putting together some recommendations, and it could be recommendations, or what are small businesses doing well, where can we go further, and I'd be interested in the panel's views on that.
Should we go the other way down the bell? Sorry.
I think on the self-employment startup, I think certainly it's an you see, I've seen a few case studies in kind of anecdotal level. So I know Prime, the Prince's initiative for mature enterprise, which is one as a part of or as a spin-off of the Prince's Foundations. They're taking a lot of old people over the age of 50, they're giving them support, not genuinely handing out big wads of money, but saying, okay, well here's where you go for financial support if you want to kind of use your skills and experience in a productive way. Clearly that's very positive, and it's mentioned a little bit in our upcoming report. It's very hard to put genuine numbers on it, because if you see someone getting up to the age of maybe 55 and they all of a sudden leave work and become self-employed, then actually the transition there, it's very hard to decide what's actually happened. And so again, the research is quite hard to find, but I completely agree that it's an avenue which could certainly not only promote more activity among older workers and use of the exact skills that they have developed themselves, but also kind of stimulate the economy as a whole. On the smaller businesses, I've seen examples kind of throughout of providing, I mean, we found an interesting example with Tesco's, obviously not a small business in any sense of the word, but they go on and on about how many young people they employ. And then we asked them how many over 60s do you employ, and it was a phenomenal amount. They just weren't talking about it. They didn't see it as something that people would find interesting. And so I think some of this stuff is going on. Sometimes it is seen almost from a kind of CSR point of view, and look how well we're doing. But again, there's not a phenomenal amount going into it, and I'll probably look into some of your stuff, I guess I will, where that has been done, where obviously the research bodies are looking at it. But I think sometimes people aren't recognising when, employing older workers is clearly a good thing, when there are a huge amount of people who are in some way saving from just kind of going into an activity in retirement, but it's not really talked about too much, which is bizarre for me.
It's interesting because I think on the one hand you have a lot of people who may be retiring in their mid to late 50s on reasonable, just about survivable pensions and lump sums. You might think, well, yeah, I can top up a little bit of freelance consultancy, a bit of self-employment. Some of them do. An awful lot don't, I think. I'd look at the self-employed training market recently, and there are apparently something like 100,000 people registered as trainers, of whom probably 10% actually are making a living. But actually, I think that disguises the real problem, which is all those retired people who aren't in that position, who haven't got semi-decent pensions or lump sums, and who may very well have to turn to self-employment, simply because that's the only kind of route they've got. And almost, almost any taxi driver you come across kind of almost falls in that category. But classically, that is often what people do. In Liverpool, for a while, almost every taxi driver used to be employed as speaker in the steelworks, and they got a bit of a lump sum, that was all. Enough to kind of buy the license of the taxi, and that's what they were doing. And you have to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week as a taxi driver anywhere in the country to make a living out of it. Chances are they don't show it in the stats, because I wouldn't like to swear how accurate they are with their returns to the inland revenue, or things like that. You can blame them to some extent. But I do think that's the real problem. People who are kind of driven into kind of involuntary and forced kind of attempts to start a little business or become self-employed, who actually much prefer not to be. And it's a bit like the stats on part-time employment, where the same pattern is emerging. Yes, part-time numbers are enormously increasing, but the proportion of them who would much prefer not to be part-time is also increasing. On SME employment patterns, it's interesting. If you look at the total number of apprenticeships, only a third of them, I think, are in. No, it's right. A third of large companies who employ more than 500 people take on apprentices. So that's 2/3 of all the large companies in this country who don't employ any apprentices at all. SMEs, on the other hand, employ far more. And by far the greatest proportion of apprentices in this country are employed by SMEs. And very often it's a family business or some little local firm that's always had that tradition of helping out the local community because they're embedded in it, or it's family and friends and so on. That's what they do. It's their obligation. And it's great. So I think there are some misconceptions about SMEs. In some ways they're kind of much worse than the big employers. Not so, very often they can actually be quite good at exemplars of good practice. Having said that, it can also be a bit informal, because one of the things we found about SME employment patterns is it tends to be kind of word of mouth, asking around. So, coming back to apprentices, one of the big problems about apprentices is there are far fewer. There are not enough BME apprentices, and that's partly because, particularly amongst SMEs, that pattern of always just recruiting through word of mouth means that you don't reach out into communities that you would normally do. So in other words, BME communities don't get the same access to apprentices that might be otherwise get. I think one of the ways that SME employment practices can be improved is through big company supply chains. And again, if you think about, say, Nissan, or public sector employees, where there are either explicit or implicit procurement rules, basically saying if you want to be part of our supply chain, you've got to be A, very good at training, and B, you've got to have pretty exemplary employment practices, as Nissan do. That drives up the kind of employment patterns amongst SMEs in the entire community. In the northeast, Nissan had an enormous effect in improving the kind of employment of a lot of the people who aspire to be part of the supply chain, because that's the only way you can get on. You have to show Nissan that you have a good training regime and got good employment practice and so on. So I think there's a lot in the way that SMEs work in this country, which is good, but perhaps some things that could be improved as well.
Well, self-employment first. I think the figure is 20% of all the workers are self-employed. I can't remember that's 50 or 65%. But it's in that region, essentially an increase of age. But as Tom said, we just don't know very much about them really. So whether they're doing 1 hour a week or 40 hours a week, we don't really know. And that's obviously crucial because they can be self-employed because they've been made redundant, and so they're trying to get any work they can, or they can be self-employed because they've set up a sustainable business. I think with employing older workers among SMEs, there's never quite enough information on SMEs. The actual employment patterns of older workers there. But in general, there are examples of businesses in particular who are focusing on retaining older workers during the recession, which might be partly why the employment rates held up. So I know BT puts a lot of effort into making sure that their skilled workers don't all retire at the same time, that they have a phased retirement process for them, so they can make use of their skills for as long as possible, and you give them different job roles in many different ways to keep them active and to pass on their knowledge to other workers. And no reason to think SMEs would do anything any differently, really. It makes perfect business sense to do that. I guess that the real barrier, though, I think across the board, not necessarily SMEs, but probably including SMEs, is in recruitment, where that's where the age discrimination, the negative stereotyping, applying to younger workers as well as older workers, and that's where it really occurs. And when you're encountered with someone you don't know, then you revert. It's human nature to revert to what you perceive about that particular group that they can be categorised in. And so it can be a big block on recruitment if you're faced with a 59-year-old interviewee who that you immediately think they don't want to learn new skills, they're just winding down for retirement, and all they want to do is just sit there for a few years and take your money without really contributing. Then you dismiss them immediately without really looking, maybe without giving them a fair chance. That's kind of human nature, really. So it's about how do we manage that, and obviously evangelising the attitudinal change message to small businesses is harder than large businesses. So you've got a very important role to play there.
I mean, just by kind of forces of logic, there must be a lot of older people becoming self-employed. I mean, self-employment has been the only source of net employment growth since the start of the recession. Employee numbers are considerably down. The over 50s are the only group that have seen increases in activity and employment rates. So the labour market participation is slightly more buoyant now than it was at the start of the recession. And given that all the net increase in employment, or most of it has been self-employed, one would expect that logically the older workers would account for most of that. I think Tom's right though, that all this rise in self-employment is quite unusual relative to the stock of self-employed, because typically self-employed people work very long hours. All these new self-employed, 90% of them are part-time. So that would suggest that either it's people going in, putting a toe in the water, go of it, or to people who would actually prefer to be employees but turn into self-employment somewhat reluctantly. I think and I think this goes to the small business question. I think the answer would be to ensure that there's government support to try and mentor and encourage those people who become self-employed to, especially if they want to sort of make a long-term go of it, support them and help them to do that. And the biggest group within the older age group that seem to be doing this are women. Going back to your search project, I would have thought there's quite a lot of scope for engaging self-employed women over 50 in this respect. And there are two elements to it. I think what you're seeing is a lot of skilled women who have lost jobs moving into self-employment to maintain their skills and sort of take things forward. I think as well what you're seeing is women who probably had skills at the time that would be useful for setting up businesses, but delayed that during child rearing years, if one can put it like that. And then when they get over 50, sort of kids have grown up and left, they sort of think of starting up a business or certainly self-employed, and a lot of them are starting as on a sort of part-time basis. So again, giving them support, I think is quite useful. And I don't really see a lot of the government activity in this area focused at them. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on trying to get young people to set up self-employed, which I actually think is probably the wrong thing to be doing, actually, because I think a lot of the young people at risk of becoming long-term employed probably aren't in the best position to create viable businesses, and probably most disadvantaged at making it go.
Sorry to say that we've run out of time. We've got a great session this afternoon, a few sessions this afternoon, so I hope you're able to hang around for that. And I think we've got refreshments out there in the foyer as well. We've had a really brilliant panel, a really great discussion. Can we thank the panel and you for waiting?